Tonight's event is all about future of transport planning, and we thought that at the start of the year it's a great opportunity to reflect on some of the huge challenges we know that we're facing and that we as a profession are going to need to tackle, both working collaboratively with other transport planners but also with other professionals from a variety of different disciplines. And we also know we're going to have to work much more closely with communities and with stakeholders to tackle some of the really big challenges. So clearly, number one, I think probably on all of our list is the climate emergency. We know this decade is crucial if we're going to make some real inroads into transport emissions and to reach our net zero targets. So what are we all going to do differently to start to really make a difference to transport emissions? We also know there's a huge challenge around the cost of living crisis, around housing. And again, I think transport planners have a huge contribution to make to tackling that challenge. And we want to touch on that a bit tonight in terms of what are the things that we can do as a profession to really come up with new solutions to some of those problems that our society faces. And obviously post-COVID, we're all still coming to terms with how that's impacted people's lifestyles, people's travel needs, and how that might affect the kind of solutions that we're all working on in our day-to-day projects. And similarly, new mobility, loads of new technologies coming on board, and we need to understand how that shapes our cities and how it might support or undermine some of our objectives. So I'm hoping that this event is going to be very wide-ranging. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers tonight. We can touch on some of these big topics. We've actually got 3 speakers in the room tonight. Unfortunately, Professor Gillian Annable is poorly today, so she sends her apologies, which is a shame. Although I know she's speaking in her role as Transport Planner of the Year at the AGM in March the 4th. So if you want to see Gillian speak, she'll be at that event. But we have 3 fantastic speakers here today. We have Jessica Matthew from the DFT, the Local Transport Directorate. We've got Victoria Hills, who's Chief Executive of RTPI and former TPS Chair. And we have Matthew Clark from our New Mobility practice at Steer. So the format for tonight is short presentations, about 8 minutes or so. We might allow a little bit longer, given that we've only got 3 speakers, but then we've got plenty of time for discussion. So we're really hoping that everyone in the room and online joins the conversation. We've set up a Slido account, so you can access that using the QR code. Is there any other way of accessing that? Okay, so you just use that hashtag. If you go through to that website, you can submit questions on there. Obviously, in the room, you can use the old-fashioned sticking your hand up. That's fine too. But equally, if you're shy, feel free to put your question on Slido. And I've got a few questions up my sleeve as well, but I'm sure we'll have a really lively discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica Matthew to kick us off, and she's going to talk about the new LTP guidance.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll try and speak loudly enough for those at the back. Is that okay? If I drop a bit, because I'm usually quite quietly spoken, then just wave at me and I'll try and make sure I'm loud enough. Thank you very much for the invite. You've given me the difficult challenge of trying to hold a microphone and press the buttons on the laptop at the same time.
It's not working, so you could put it down.
Yeah. I thought it was working for people remotely.
Yeah.
So I thought I would talk to you briefly about what we're planning on local transport plans. But before I did that, I thought I'd just set out some recent developments that we've had in the department and things that you may or may not have noticed in the transport field. So we have recently launched the £2 single bus fare just between January and March to try and encourage people to come back onto buses because patronage levels are still not quite as high as they were before COVID. We also recently had the announcement of Levelling Up Fund 2 with lots and lots of projects announced. And quite a lot of them went to transport, and quite a lot of them went on things like buses and active travel. And we've also recently established Active Travel England, and the photo in the bottom right is of Chris Boardman of Olympic gold medal fame, who is the Commissioner for Active Travel England. Danny Williams is the Chief Exec in the middle, and Louise Wilkinson is the Chief Operating Officer on the right. So it is getting established now in York. The other big topical thing that's taking up quite a lot of our time in the Department for Transport, and even more my colleagues across the road in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, is Michael Gove's aspiration to have devolution deals. And you might be thinking, why is there a slide on devolution deals when this is about local transport plans? But what devolution deals do quite often is put local authorities together. So in the North East, there are 7 local authorities in the North East devolution deal that was announced over Christmas. That means they will have one local transport plan. And as some of us were discussing just before this event started, I think that's a good thing for transport and transport planning. My personal prejudice is that quite often local authorities are a little bit too small to do local transport planning. It's a Victorian system, and transport's changed quite a lot since the 19th century. So doing it on a slightly larger scale is a good thing. I'm not going to patronise this audience by explaining what a local transport plan is. I suspect most of you know that it's set out in statute. It's a legal requirement for a local authority to produce a local transport plan. It's supposed to set out what future investments and how transport should run within the area. It's supposed to cover a reasonably long period of time. We used to mark local authorities' homework in the department. We haven't done that for a very long time. As a result, some of them have lapsed a bit. But we do still think that local transport plans are a really important part of the transport system, because you don't need me to stand here and tell you that transport is complicated. It costs a heck of a lot of money, and it takes quite a long time to deliver. So if we don't think about what we're going to do before we start, we're almost certain to get it wrong. It also poses quite a lot of problems, the kind of things that economists like to call externalities, with decarbonisation or safety or all kinds of other trade-offs or problems. And the local transport plan is a good place to explain how the local authority is going to tackle some of those trade-offs and what it thinks it can do to resolve some of them. And it also is a place to set out how much it's all going to cost. So because we think they're really important, we have repeated it in several government strategies and said that we would really, really like local authorities producing local transport plans. Clearly, the topic of the overall strategy changes the tone slightly in the way that that's phrased, but I think the message is pretty consistent. We would like local transport plans, and in a moment I'll touch on the commitment in the bottom left-hand corner about quantifying carbon reductions, which I think is new and shows just how important decarbonisation is to us. You'll also be aware in this audience that there are an awful lot of plans already. We're not really asking people to produce a lot of new ones. There's a local spatial plan. I think that's one of the most important plans a local authority produces. It's a local transport plan. And then there's some various modal plans that we do ask for, like the local cycle investment plan, or an electric vehicle infrastructure charging plan, or a bus service improvement plan. We think these all should fit together. The local transport plan should fit above some of the modal strategies, and it should sit underneath the local plan. I said I'd come back to quantifying carbon reduction. I think this is new. In its essence, it's really, really simple. We want places to tot up how much carbon emissions they have currently. We want them to produce their local transport plan and set out how they're going to reduce those emissions, and then we want to top them up again. And hopefully the second number is smaller than the first number, and if it's not smaller, to go back and look at the plan again until it is smaller. That's really it. It's dead simple, except that, of course, we do know that totting up carbon emissions is a fiendishly complicated thing to do. So we have asked the subnational transport bodies whether they will give a hand with how some of this work is done. We're not so worried about some of the big combined authorities, but some of the smaller authorities we think might find it really, really quite tricky. So we have asked the subnational transport bodies to give us a hand. If they're marked green here, I see my slide, it's got slightly corrupted at the journey from DFT to here. But anyway, I think you broadly get the picture. Some of them are completely ready. Some of them are just working it up. So I'm going to stop talking now, but the key points I wanted to leave with you were, I think devolution deals and the devolution agenda is really, really relevant to what we will do on local transport plans. Partly because of how it will affect the money, but mainly because it will be doing local transport planning over a slightly bigger geography. We're working up the local transport plan guidance and the quantifying carbon reduction guidance right now. So a lot of the emails sitting in my inbox today are on this topic, so it really is very live. We will go out to consultation shortly. Clearly, we've got local elections coming up in May. We're not allowed to publish things in the run up to local elections. That might affect the timing a little bit. We have done quite a lot of big significant things in the last few weeks and months. So I think setting up Active Travel England is a really significant development. It has a lot of staff, 98 staff, that's quite a lot for a government department to put into one of its arm's length bodies. I think the Levelling Up Fund has given a lot of money to transport and is definitely worth looking across its allocations to get a flavour of the kind of things that this new set of ministers are interested in. And I think the £2 bus fare is quite symbolic of the investment and interest in buses. We were talking just before this started about how buses can be a bit of a Cinderella service. I think that shows that ministers have really noticed the importance of buses and their importance in the Levelling Up agenda. Local transport plans will be the focus of how we interact with local authorities in the future. The Levelling Up white paper talks about having fewer competitions in the future and setting multi-year funding. We can only do that. I can only persuade the Treasury that that's a sound investment to make if I can be reasonably clear what places are going to do with the money once they've got it. Local transport plans should be holistic place-based strategies. That's the kind of thing you'd expect me to say. And I think they really do need to set clear plans for decarbonisation. Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. That's brilliant. I've got lots of questions in the back of my mind for later, but we'll hold on to those until the Q&A section. So next we've got Victoria Hills, who's the Chief Executive of the RTPO. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here this afternoon. It is actually a bit like Back to the Future. Nicola and I actually go back quite a way together. We were on an MSc transport planning in Oxford Brookes last century. That's how far we go back. And I left Steer Davies Gleave, as it was then, in 2002. And of course, as you mentioned, I was chair of the Transport Planning Society from 2009 to 2011. And it's a real treat just to take time out from the day job, which is now wasn't on my career path to end up running the Professional Institute for Town Planners, but nevertheless, that's where I've ended up currently. But it is a treat to take time out to answer the exam question: how can we work with the planning profession more effectively in 2023 to deliver better land use integration, which was partly a reason why I got into the job in the first place, actually, last century. I haven't got any slides. I'm just going to share with you some musings that I've jotted down. So if you see me squinting, it's a terrible habit I've got of writing down things down very quickly, and then I can't actually read my handwriting. But we'll see how we go. I'm trying not to tell jokes these days, but I have got a one-liner for you, a monorail. I said you'd laugh. Apparently, I told that joke 10 years ago. It wasn't funny then. It wasn't funny now. But he likes it. He likes it, so it stuck with him. Yes. So actually, I can only vaguely remember telling that joke. But anyway, next time I come, I'll have better jokes. But I'm going to structure this around sort of three frameworks, if you like, my observations as to what we need to do on policy, structural and funding. But then I've got a long list of solutions, trying to be solutions focused as to how we can actually get the things working much better. And really great to come after your presentation, because there is some, though we didn't prepare, there is some similarity in some of my solutions to those you've just alluded. The first thing is it's quite complex, talking about the policy framework. So if we think about the world of land use and then transport, and some of what I'm saying is much more land use focused, which I guess that's helpful in a sense, because whilst I started my career in transport planning, that's not really where I am now. A lot of you are transport planners, so bringing that land use focus in. At the national level, we've got a lot of noise about the Levelling Up Regeneration Bill at the moment, which is on its way to getting royal assent. And that makes it very clear that a strong planning system, unlike my voice, sorry, I've been hanging out with apprentices this morning, I'm losing my voice already. A strong planning system is essential to delivering levelling up. Without it, it's not going to happen. We've got the National Planning Policy Framework, which wouldn't usually get daily headlines, but it does because it's all tied in with housing numbers, green belt, and you name it, it is in the news quite regularly. And then you've got within that policy framework, beyond the usual planning stuff, the local plans, which I'll come back to, you've also got a lot of tools that relate to your part of the world, and probably the more significant one of those, which I'll come back to, is a manual for streets, actually, and the revision to that. Within what I'm calling the structural framework, which is how you get things done, yes, you've got this devolved area, and we've seen that in London for the last 2 decades, but increasingly now you've got the city regions, the combined authorities with new powers. Some of them have got new powers, but certainly new ambitions. We've got another area that things happen at is that county district area. And that's an interesting one, and always has been for transport, because you've got one authority that's responsible for the land use, and you've got one authority that's responsible for the transport. Sometimes they're really aligned, and sometimes they're not. And where it really starts to pinch is when one authority collects the infrastructure levy, but the other one needs to spend it. And perhaps we'll come on to that. And then the other part of the structural framework, the bit that perhaps is working better is where you've got the unitaries. And I spend a lot of time speaking to chief planning officers now, and they have a lot more success at getting stuff done when they can have everyone around the table with the same employer. And by that, I mean the highways engineers with the planners, who all are answering to the same elected leader, does actually help from a structural perspective. So that's the policy and the structure, if you like. Then there's the funding framework, just to reflect on. And, you know, to this day, it's probably true that a lot of transport funding sits in different pots to a lot of land use funding, whether it comes through the local plan settlements or whether local transport settlements. Very, very different system to the planning money, which comes through the community infrastructure levy, comes through Section 106 agreements, or it just comes through the betterment that's been delivered. And sometimes those bits of money come together very well, sometimes they don't. And there's all other new bits of money as well. So speaking to local authorities, many of them are in the business of chasing the levelling up funding, or the investment zones funding, or high streets funding, or active travel funding, or you name it, there's a fund for it somewhere in a government department. The next one will be biodiversity net gain funding, and you know there's a whole load of environmental funding coming down the line from DEFRA, we hope. And so I guess that just kind of illustrates that it is a really, really complex set of circumstances that leads us, some of us who've been in our career now going into our 3rd decade, still talking about lack of integration between transport and land use, because you've got a very complicated policy framework, you've got a very complicated structural framework in terms of who actually does it, and then you've got a very complicated funding framework. And, you know, that is just the way it is. You know, the two government departments that probably need to work close together are only separated by a road, but they answer to very different tunes, and they've got slightly different agendas, and perhaps they don't always meet as much as they could do discuss. The other part of this complicated structural stroke policy framework is the current consultation on the NPPF that is consulting on national development management policies, which might not immediately seem that important for transport planning, but could be, because it's the nationalisation of some policies. We don't know which yet, because the consultation's not happened. And what does that mean for transport planning at a local level or a regional level? We just don't know. So moving on to solutions, I've got a long list of ideas, actually. I'm very fortunate. I've been in this job now for nearly 5 years. So I do have lots of solutions and, you know, reflections of having worked for all 3 mayors of London, seeing what works in London, and now having the fantastic luxury of being able to go out around the country, the UK, but also internationally to see what works. One of the challenges we've got, which I appreciate many departments have, possibly DfT also, is, you know, that lack of consistency. We're now on the 6th housing minister in a year, which, you know, it was sort of funny at the start of 2022, but actually we're seriously losing our sense of humour now on it. You know, it is really challenging just when you get the minister up to speed on certain topics, to then say goodbye to her last night on the eve of a very important apprenticeships event this morning that she could no longer attend, for example. That's a trivial point, but the serious point is it's that kind of stop-start the whole time. So on to solutions. Well, devolution was mentioned. Looking at it from a planning land use perspective, the place where integration has worked really well at getting boroughs joined up, getting infrastructure projects over the line with Treasury, getting housing numbers agreed and not in dispute with neighbours, is of course the Greater London Authority area. And the jewel in the crown is the spatial development strategy that is the London Plan. Now, the London Mayor is the only elected mayor in the UK that has those SDS powers. Steve Rotherham has similar powers, and I believe he will use them. But it can be no coincidence that all the things that have happened in London over the last 20 years have come to pass in isolation from the spatial strategy. I don't think, for example, that any mayor of London could have convinced the IOC or IPC that we could deliver the Olympic Games unless there was that spatial wraparound document that provide that certainty that this was the strategic plan. And when I look at the other devolved areas and I speak to some of those city mayors about what they're trying to do, I can sense their frustrations that they haven't got those powers, and they can go so far along a certain route and then somebody can decide that they don't like that route. We've seen it in the southwest, and then they're kind of almost back to square one again. So for me, the spatial development strategy powers have to be the solution at a citywide, sub-regional level. Appreciate that's not going to help rural necessarily, for joining up land use and transport. And within that, within all of the planning reform, we've got to have chief planning officers back up at the top table of local government. We've got to have planning fees going back up. Again, a point I made with the Chancellor this week is, can we just get on with it, please? Because developers will pay more, but at the moment, planning departments are 50% down on staff over the last 10 years. And that will hold up highway schemes, it will hold up infrastructure, it will hold up all of the above. I mentioned the NPPF, and there has to be stronger hooks in there for bringing together the worlds of transport and land use. We don't think they're strong enough at the moment. We think, you know, the guidance to use the manual for street is not strong enough. We think it's an excellent document. It needs to be mandated. There's no point just saying it would be nice to use it. If we require local authorities to use it, they will use it. If we don't, they won't. It's as simple as that. And believe me, I've spoken to local politicians about it. So that's got to be strengthened up. I mentioned resources, and this is a problem, I'm sure, in the world of transport as much as it is in the land use, the planning side of it, is we're really struggling for resources. There aren't enough planners around. and there aren't enough specialist services around, which will impact transport as well. Things like ecology as biodiversity net gain comes in. So a solution is to share some of those services across boundaries, and we've seen Greater Cambridge do that, for example. We think we need a lot more of that as one of the solutions. Plan making, so really pleased to hear, I didn't pay you, I didn't bribe you to say that, but you're absolutely right. Plan making, apart from fiscal powers for local authorities, is the #1 power that local authorities have, because it's a statutory local plan, and tying anything else into that is definitely the way forward. So it's really important that local areas have up-to-date local plans, because it's not just, oh, so that we can get all the plans and no, our plan is great, we planned the world. It's actually far more important than that, because if you don't have your 5-year land supply agreed, then what happens is local authorities will speculatively develop where they want, and they'll win them on appeals in presumption of sustainable development. And when you see things in the news about this greenbelt site got released, that got released, that is because a local authority doesn't have an up-to-date local plan. Why is that important for transport? Well, I'm sure it's obvious to all of you, but these sites are in the middle of nowhere. You know, there's no transport, they're not using brownfield, they're not densifying, they're not in the centre, because they're what I call, not quite the hostage sites, as another word, it will come to me. Those are the sites that people would take a punt on because the local plans aren't up to date, and they will win at appeal, and they are winning at appeal. And it drives the coach and horses through anything else you're trying to do on sustainable transport. Only 40% of local authorities have an up-to-date local plan. The current uncertainty I mentioned at the moment is seeing the ball fall by the wayside. Those of you who follow any of this on LinkedIn will see that, you know, there's leading barristers and cases keeping the tally now on how many local authorities have said, we're not going to update a local plan because we're waiting to see what the government are doing with the planning form. So the solution there is certainty, and I will be saying that to the new housing minister. Said it to the other one 3 weeks ago, but when we get to sit down with the new one very shortly, we'll be making that point. Another solution to integrating transport and land use is being able to better quantify the benefits just beyond just transport benefits. You know that, but something we've tried to do at the RTPI is a Treasury speak business case called Invest and Prosper, which is, you know, for every penny you invest in planning, this is what you get. So there are some fantastic stats in our research, and I'll happily send these around afterwards. For example, you know, a well-planned neighbourhood supports 59% of NHS recommended weekly activity. Well, it's obvious. I mean, you know that, don't you? Because it means you can walk and cycle. You don't have to just drive everywhere. But sadly, the Treasury don't quite get that yet. So, you know, it's that investment upstream that really impacts downstream many, many years after things were agreed in local plans. Digital and data has been mentioned, and making better use of that is already here. For those of you who listen to the likes of Times Radio, if you're working from home, as I do, you know, the Meta adverts are fascinating. Has anyone heard the Meta adverts? You know, welcome to the metaverse. The first bit of it is we've created the metaverse to help the surgeons of tomorrow practice the surgery, and the highways engineers of the future plan the roads. It's there already now. They've created it. So we've really got to get with it. That's mainstream lunchtime radio now. And it sort of jolts me. It's like, wow, I'm going to need to get in there and find out what it's about when I get some time, but not quite made it yet. So where am I? Only a couple more. You cut me off if I'm speaking too long. No, it's okay. Collectively, as a built environment professionals, we need to get better at telling the story about what we're doing. Because there's lots of people in the general public just don't understand it or get it, or quite frankly, we're at the back of a very long queue for other things that need public funding at the moment, you know, without spelling it out, but we are all conscious of what's going on and the cost of living crisis and all the rest of it, but being able to demonstrate the purpose of what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it can help deliver some of those better outcomes downstream is really, really important beyond just a carbon saving. We've really got to make far more on health, far more of that, I believe. And so One thing we've been doing is working with content providers. There's an organisation called Content with Purpose that we're working with to create stories and films and podcasts to start pushing this stuff out to demystify and myth bust, if you like, what planners are doing. And I would commend that transport planners think about doing the same, to shake off any images of, the highways engineers or, the geeky modelers or whatever, which, yeah, we need all of that. But actually, stating your relevance now is going to be very important, particularly as we move forward, to welcoming in a new government at some point, and why it's important now to really invest in this stuff. I mentioned I was with apprentices this morning. We launched our Chartered Town Planner apprenticeship back in 2019. It was a bit of a struggle then with the government to get it over the line. We got it over just before the pandemic. So you can imagine the joy today to be up with the Vice Chancellor of London South Bank University. They've now got 230 town planning apprentices and growing weekly through this apprenticeship route. And it's a fantastic way of bringing the next generation in from a broad talent pool who would never ever thought of going into a career in town planning or transport planning. So that is something that I know TPS has probably been looking at. And there is so much hunger out there from business to get on and do this. And I genuinely think it's part of the solution, because bringing in some of those fresh ideas is going to be very helpful as we welcome in the Generation Zers who have had a pretty rough time in the pandemic and think very differently about the future world to some of us older and have a very valid contribution to make. So my final point, if you like, my final flagship of the solutions, I talked about devolution, but the real jewel in the crown in devolution is actually fiscal devolution. This isn't a political point here, but I do think some of the metro mayors who were very vocal about their annoyance at not doing so well in the levelling up funding made a very clear point that if they have been elected by the region, could they not just have had a devolved amount for them to allocate locally rather than it being done centrally? And when I look at what London has been able to achieve, a lot of it has been through the spatial plan, but a lot of it has been because of the financial deals that were done with Treasury to underwrite some of the borrowing. And I put it very recently to the Infrastructure Projects Authority, you need to do far more of those deals and underwriting that borrowing for the other regions so that they could get on and deliver the infrastructure that London's been able to deliver. And we need to move away from, and you may tell me, well, we've left this, and that will show that I'm out of touch, but we need to move away from 25, 30-year paybacks for business rates or for SIL. We need to move away from that. If you can domestically borrow for your own house a 50-year mortgage now, then I'm sure it's not beyond the wit of man that you can borrow for a railway over a 200-year period. That's really where we need to be thinking. So fiscal devolution, stretching out the borrowing, and enabling some of those metro mayors to be the masters of their own destiny in a way that London has benefited greatly. And that's certainly a message that I'll be taking to the metro mayors as I continue to meet with them. And I wish them all well with it. So I guess in summary, I think, in terms of how we can work better with the planning profession to get more effective land use integration, I think the solutions are there for us, actually. Some of them I've set out, you'll have others. My own view, not that of the RTPI, I should say, is there is no point sitting around waiting for government to come up with solutions because you will just be waiting a very long time. It's for us as professionals and anybody in industry to just get on with it, actually, and come up with the solutions and be innovative, because they're not coming from government anytime soon, because there are other broader distractions which we see playing out in the media. So, I would say the future is bright. The solutions are there. We've got the test case in London. Let's build on that. Cities of the future, but of course, let's not forget the rural as well. Thanks very much for listening.
Victoria. That's brilliant. Loads again to go out there. Lots of focus on plan making, which is good, but also good to get into some of the governance and some of the fiscal elements as well. So I'm sure we'll get into that in the Q&A. So last speaker, and then we'll go into discussion. Matt Clark, who heads up our new mobility team, is going to talk a bit about the role of new modes, technology, and how that might shape the work that we will do as transport planners.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I'm just getting my slides lined up,
Sorry.
so I know we're on the right one here. So that's me. So yes, Matthew Clark, I work in new mobility. What does new mobility mean? In the context of this, new mobility means zero emission vehicles and infrastructure. It means shared mobility, which is the focus of this topic, and we'll dig into that in a bit more detail. And also then emerging services. So sort of technologies which we aren't seeing in our cities in the UK yet, we may in the future, and they may disrupt the world a little more than we think, such as connected and autonomous vehicles. But that's not the focus of the talk today. So today, as I mentioned, and just to note actually, as well as my role at Steer, I'm also chair of Como UK, which is the charity for the benefit of shared mobility. So I'd like to talk about the role of shared mobility alongside public transport to help support the key transport planning objectives of improving transport accessibility, reducing carbon, and also helping our people and places to become more healthy. And I'm going to frame shared mobility looking at 4 topics. As you can see, the opportunity, the risks, the challenge, and then I'm not promising the whole solution, but I'm going to hint on it towards the end. And just to give you a sense of how quickly the world is changing, and linking to the built environment as well, this is a picture of some shared e-scooters around the back of Waterloo Station. The building, which frames behind it, 1950s derelict building, now demolished. So that's no longer there. So the world is changing. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the opportunity. And here I would like to frame the variety of transport modes which have been introduced to our cities and towns across the UK and that are an intrinsic part of helping us to become less reliant on the private car. The first of these is shared bikes. Now this is the new e-bike launched on the TfL cycle hire scheme earlier this year. There are now 500 of these bikes added to the 12,000 bikes, regular bikes. And e-bikes are becoming an important part of shared bike schemes, adding the ability to travel further, to use less effort and widening the appeal of that mode. More diversity. I'm sure no one in this room can fail to notice that in the UK, we have been doing some e-scooter trials. This is not a picture in the UK, this is in Copenhagen, where alongside the huge transition to cycling and more sustainable forms of transport, shared e-scooters form an important part of that. E-scooters only legal in the UK as part of trials. Apart from here today, they are becoming legalised in Gibraltar. So Gibraltar is the first place to legalise private e-scooters in the UK. So what Gibraltar does first, we shall see what happens next. Shared cargo bikes. So a couple of years ago, if someone said to me, will we be seeing shared cargo bikes, e-cargo bikes on the streets of the UK anytime soon, I would have said no. These are bikes in Hackney. We've also seen some bikes on the street being tested in Manchester. So this is starting to happen. So providing bikes for those trips where perhaps you need to carry something, whether it's people or goods, I'd suggest we won't be carrying people in those, given the little lid on the front. More diversification, shared e-mopeds. So clearly a minority mode in the UK, people using motorbikes and mopeds, but there is a role of shared e-mopeds, and there are the first examples of those on the streets of London. Then we've got moving up to the next size, so shared electric vehicles. So we'll be familiar with the idea of a car club where we can use a car by the hour on an app-based service. If we add electric vehicles into that, we have lower carbon forms of car clubs. And this example here is pictured in Paris. This is a very small electric quadricycle launched by Citroën, which has a much smaller form and is perhaps the antidote to the large SUVs that clog up our streets. Now, I've shown you lots of form factor, but I think it's really important, what does this add to the mix? So there is quite a bit of evidence that shows what the benefits of some of these modes are. And here are some examples from the COMO UK, which is an independent survey of car club members. And these are surveys that are repeated year on year and demonstrate the reduction in private car ownership from car clubs. So each car club removing around 20 private cars from the street. Lower emissions as the fleets are newer and often electric, and also providing a cheaper alternative for people who maybe are owning their car as well. And a final one is car clubs also reduce the annual mileage by car. Each member tends to drive less miles. So I said I would talk about the risks. So the risks of shared transport are no different to the risks of any other new transport technology. When we introduced cars to our streets, we spent decades trying to work out where to park them. Eventually, we decided to control parking in cities, and we introduced controlled parking zones. And then we made people pay for their parking. Shared bikes, it's been a faster journey. This is a picture in Wandsworth, and the headline chaos is the sort of thing you see on the BBC News. Now, I agree, that is chaos. And why is it chaos? It's chaos because the coming together of the private sector and the public sector has not worked on this occasion. Operators are operating either with permission of authorities or without permission. And the challenge here is there is not provision for parking of these bicycles. So actually, users want to use them, but there's nowhere to park them. So if we see in some places allocated parking on the street where cars are parked, for vehicles such as this is the way forward. Then we have the equitable provision of services. This is a map of London, and it shows the Zipcar service, Zipcar Flex. This allows you to take a mainly electric car from one part of London to another. As you can see, if you live in, let's say, if you live in Islington, or if you live in parts of Ealing, that service is available to you. If you live in Camden, the local authority does not believe the benefits of this service, so therefore is not allowing these cars to stop in Camden. The cars can drive through Camden, causing traffic congestion, potentially, adding no benefits to the residents of Camden, but those cars cannot stop. So this is an example of the need for a joined-up approach. I think many of our speakers have noted this. There are many risks. Another risk is funding. So we talk a lot about, subsidy. So we say we subsidise this, we subsidise that. We particularly talk about public transport subsidy. We talk about road investment. Why do we talk about road investment and public transport subsidy? I suggest we need to start changing the way we talk about things and talk about investing in those modes that have the most benefits. Edinburgh had a cycle hire scheme which was funded by the private sector, and that particular funding model did not work. The operator had to withdraw the bikes, and there is now no public bike sharing service in Scotland's first city. So there are funding challenges, and personally I think that we need to reframe the way we talk about investment and subsidy, and we need to think about the benefits. So moving forward, I really want to set this in the challenge, and the challenge here is, and this is not the elephant in the room, this is fairly front and centre, it's car ownership. When people own cars, they've invested in those vehicles, they're sitting outside their houses, and the moment they use some other transport mode, they are effectively having to pay again. So let's have a look at what's happened in the last 10 years. So the census has just come out recently with data on car ownership. This is reporting data from 348 authorities across the UK. And I'd like people to guess how many authorities have seen an increase in car ownership over that 10-year period.
All of them. So total car ownership or car ownership per head of population?
How many authorities now have more cars? That's the question.
Apart from Greater London.
We've got very good answers in the room. You probably can't hear online. The answer to the question is 314 authorities have had an increase in the number of cars across the UK, actually slightly lower than all of them. So next question is, how many authorities have fewer cars from 2011 to 2021? We've got 5. Anybody else with 5?
34.
34. There are 9 authorities that have fewer cars. There are some authorities that have the same number of cars, give or take. That's the difference between the two. So, final question, audience participation. How many, and this is a rough number, how many additional cars are there in England and Wales in 2021 compared to 2011?
20%.
A number, please. That is a number, but a quantity of cars.
80 million.
30 million. 6 million.
6 million. Oh, well, it's 3 million. So that's on and these not, don't quote me on these numbers, but it's from something like 25 million to 28 million. There's a lot. So this is the challenge we're facing. We have 3 million more cars. And if we remember some of our transport planning policies, are we trying to increase car ownership? I don't think so. Do we even talk about car ownership? We talk about car use. We talk about we don't talk about VMT because it's an American term. We talk about modal share, and we talk about trips by car. If we have 3,000 more cars and only 9 authorities with fewer cars, this is the challenge. So, and this is not the solution, but this is a solution. Okay, we've talked a lot about holistic approaches. We've talked about bringing things together. One of the challenges in our urban area is we have a finite amount of space. We have a finite amount of space to move, and we have a finite amount of space to park. Now, we do a lot of work about movement. We put in cycle lanes, we put in bus lanes. We do a huge amount of work trying to make things flow more well. But what we don't tend to think about is the parking at either end of the journey. Now, I commend Lambeth for producing this curbside strategy, which came out last month. And if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to say a couple of stats from this strategy. And I was actually with Lambeth before this, talking about this, and I think they're one of the first authorities to holistically look at the curb space in their borough. 94% of the curb space in the borough of Lambeth is used for car parking. 58% of households in Lambeth do not own a car. That is not equitable use of curb space. So after quantifying the amount of curb space, they're now setting out a holistic strategy to address this, so that 25% of curb space should be used for sustainable uses. Now, these sustainable uses include many things, including things like parklets and sustainable urban drainage. But given my talking is about shared transport, the things that I picked out were the following things. So Lambeth has said, going forward, there will be a full electric car club vehicle on every street in Lambeth. There'll be a borough-wide network of bike hire locations, no more than 5 minutes walk from every household. Shared cargo bikes will be available. Again, no more than 5 minutes walk from all households. And local high streets will have access to a shared electric car. So I'm just going to leave you with a thought that we really need a holistic approach to think about how we use the space in our cities, and that shared mobility is the glue that goes together with public transport to provide a realistic alternative to private car use for many people. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Loads of questions coming in on Slido, so I might take us straight to some of those, but also equally happy to take some questions from the room if anyone's got any burning questions. There were a couple of questions for you, Jessica, about the LTP guidance. One was asking for a bit more of a steer, which you may not be able to give us on when we might expect it. Is it ready to go? Is it just waiting for ministerial sign-off, or are you still beavering away at it? And also a question about whether this set of guidance is going to be more focused on a vision-led approach rather than predict and provide. Do I need to give? Sorry.
I've been a Whitehall civil servant for nearly a quarter of a century, and that's taught me never ever to give predictions about when government publications might emerge, even in periods where it was somewhat more predictable and stable than we have seen the political cycle over the last 12 months. That was a rash thing to do. So I'm really sorry, I'm not going to do it now. It is due out shortly, and that's the most I'm going to be able to say. We are expecting it to be more of a vision-led approach and less on predict and provide. But things can change in documents sometimes. So wait and see.
great, thank you. And a couple of questions about the planning regime, Victoria, for you. It's like quick fire questions.
Yeah.
One was about the guidance on TAs and travel plans and whether you think there's an opportunity to broaden that to cover a wider range of outcomes around health and environmental impacts and so on.
Yes. Do I need to speak in
Oh,
that?
sorry.
Yes, yes, absolutely. What we are consulting with our members about at the moment on the National Planning Policy Framework consultation, it's a bit of a mouthful, but effectively that is the Bible that all local plans have to be in conformity with, is to ensure exactly that, because it's really silent on health, it's very silent on environment and net zero and climate action, climate change. And so I don't want to preempt what the formal committee agrees at the end of February before we get our response in for the 3rd of March. But I suspect that we will be majoring on the need for the MPPF to sharpen up on the broader aspects, including health, including environment. So yes, it is very much in our members' mind that if it's not there, developers won't do it because there's no statutory basis on which to require it.
Great, thank you. And Matt, a quick question from you, which I think is actually from Mark. So I don't know if you want to ask it about the role of technology and whether it actually gets people out of their cars.
So it's Mark Frost, current chair of TPS for another 6 or 7 weeks. Get them excited about shared mobility, and clearly it does hold great potential in changing the way that we travel. But there is a concern that it doesn't necessarily lead to huge amounts of extraction of car journeys. It just moves people who were maybe walking onto e-bikes or people that were on the bus onto these facilities. So I just wondered if is there an answer to that, or are we still finding a way on whether these things offer genuine modal shift?
I think there's a bit of both. So certainly in terms of bike share, there's a number of years evidence of the benefits of bike share. Yes, some trips do come from other modes, which are also good. I guess the reality is if you put in an LRT, you get some trips from bus. So, I guess the focus here, I think, is about complementarity. The other thing I would say is about linked trips. So there's an awful lot of shared mobility which links to public transport. So it's first and last mile. And the bit that's a bit more uncertain is on the e-scooter side, because one, the scooters are much newer. They were introduced during a pandemic, so lots of the evidence is about people making trips during the pandemic. And finally, in order to use an e-scooter legally in the UK, you have to have a driving license. So actually, all those people who might want to get around who can't drive and are not in scope. So I think the answer is we know something, but we need to know more.
Thanks, Matthew. I've got a question which was, so I suppose, reflecting on the fact that we've had a lot of focus on, we've had a lot of focus on long-term planning and the importance of plans, and yet it feels like we're facing all these really, really urgent challenges. I'm just wondering whether you've got thoughts about, can we short circuit some of that, or do we need to spend a lot of time developing very long-term plans that can often take several years in their own right to deliver, or are there things we can be getting on and doing more quickly, sort of outside, or coming up with new ways of delivering those plans? I don't know whether maybe start with Victoria first.
Yes, I mean, one of the things I mentioned was the need to have a statutory chief planning officer in every local authority, because that's not currently a requirement. We've just got it over the line with the Scottish Government that it will be as part of the Scottish Planning Bill, but we think that the business of placemaking is quite important, and there should be a statutory officer who has responsibility for place. This was recognised in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, but nothing much has come of it. There was a few words in the Levelling Up Bill, possibly, white paper, but we're pushing that now through the Lords. Why is that important? Well, if you've got someone with authority and who can and delegation, they can do things faster. Yes, it is very important to have your statutory local plan that's recognised as such, but actually having the right level of authority, what I call in very basic terms, somebody who's holding the ring and joining the dots, but has the authority and some level of delegation to get on and do things real time is really important. And that's what's missing in local authorities at the moment. We have seen through our own research the watering down of that importance of that role. So when I started out my first job in local government over 20 years ago, you know, the chief officer, planning officer, and again, it's applicable to transport because there used to be, you know, chief highways engineers or engineers in counties, they've all gone, you know, and it's where are these people who are actually being able to find that innovation, find ways to get things, the right outcomes to happen. And our research showed that 70-80% local authorities don't have a chief officer at the top table anymore. And we think it's really important that there is. So I think that will be part of our solution, is trying to have a senior enough officer in the authority who has that level of delegation where they can actually use that delegation to push through things a little bit quicker, obviously within the realms of some of the broader frameworks I talked about earlier.
I tend to think about this just as you would if you were going to paint a picture. If you were going to paint a big picture, you would draw some kind of pencil outline first, which would set where the big things were in the picture, where your sheep were, where the landscape was, where the windmill went. You might not colour it all in straight away. I think the strategy needs to be that pencil outline, putting where the key things are on the landscape or into the painting. And then you might need to colour it in. And which bit, whether you colour in the bottom right-hand corner or the top left-hand corner, might be affected by what's going on in the wider environment, which is really a rather long metaphor to say, yes, you need to think about strategy, but you also need to think about tactics. And any organisation, but particularly one in the public sector that isn't thinking about tactics, what the hell is it for? It's not acting properly. And if it's not thinking long-term as well as short-term, it's just not doing its job properly. So I think it needs to do both. And that's probably true in consultancy too, but I've never been a consultant.
I have been a consultant. I like the metaphor of painting a picture. What I'd say is that when we paint a picture, we need to be broad about the things we can include in that picture. So experience in working on shared transport, shared mobility projects is it's a competition as to who can secure funding. And those people who are good at competitions are good at winning money. And these projects are not particularly expensive in the grand scheme of things, but yet require huge scrutiny in terms of business cases. So a project of a road scheme that requires, you know, £100 million worth of investment versus a public bike share scheme, which requires £1.5 million of investment, require the same scrutiny. So in terms of moving things quickly, I think there's a thing about proportionality here.
And that comes back to, thank you. That comes back to my earlier point about fiscal devolution, because that is quite a bizarre situation you've described, but that is the reality nevertheless.
Yeah. Brilliant, great answers. We've got a question at the back of the room. Do I need to sprint down to the back of the room? You can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Nicola. I'm John Carr. I'm here today wearing the hat of the Association of Transport Coordinating Officers. And the points I'd like to make are really mainly addressed at Jessica. And I congratulate her for her bravery in coming here before this audience after the years that we have lived through with conflicting statements and advice from different departments of government. The first point I'd like to make is if you, as government, or maybe as senior civil servants, want local authorities to deliver, and this is really a point that Victoria's made very well, you can't keep giving them powers and duties without also willing the resources for them to deliver them. You probably meant it as just a throwaway, but what particularly cut me was 98 people suddenly appearing in York to deal with shared mobility or active mobility, and that probably now is more than the number of local authority chief officers that have got direct chief officer responsibility for either transport or planning outside the GLA and possibly the combined authorities. you know, and this is the result not only of the austerity that this government has had, I think it's something that has been going on for years. The important areas of local government, as politicians see them, tend to be education, social services, the personal services. As austerity has bitten, departments have been combined, again, Victoria's point, that you now see people that have got no chief officer access even, but are in charge of budgets like public transport, are in charge of budgets like road maintenance. So that's one point. Second point I'd like to address to the whole panel. Can we please start recognising buses as active travel? More or less by definition, every bus journey includes at least one walking mode, and a complex bus journey includes several. And if that could be adopted by the DfT, just making the simple point, I think that might force at least officers to think about it, if not initially members. And finally, a funding point at this stage. Buses carry at least as many people in the UK as a whole as rail services do, probably more. When I was a chief officer in West Yorkshire, 90% of our commuters came in by bus, 10% by rail, and that was more or less the inverse of the time that the PTE board at that time spent discussing the two modes. If you allocated half the money that was in the planning period for national highways, or whatever they're calling themselves today, that would fund throughout England at least the whole of the national bus strategy, according to the estimates which have been produced by credible local authority operators, officers and bus operators, where the cost is about 12 to 15 million. And that, incidentally, is relatively small change by comparison with money that I deliberately say was wasted by the government's conflicting messages over what you should do with public transport over COVID. So these, again, I think are context points that need to be made. Possibly one of the solutions to the last point about funding as well is to ask the Treasury why small schemes, small capital schemes, bigger revenue streams, seems like all public transport alternatives to big capital spending should not be mandated to be accompanied by every scheme application. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you. Right. I didn't have my paper, so I'm trying to remember all of those questions, but main focus was on resourcing, and particularly resourcing of local authorities and their ability to respond to some of these challenges, and particular focus on the role of buses, I think, came into both questions, and the kind of relative weight and funding that's given to buses relative to other modes. Jessica, I don't know where you want to start with those questions.
Thank you. And can I just say, John, it would be really dull to come to an event and not have at least one questioner who wasn't entirely pleased with government. I'd be disappointed to walk out of the room, so please don't apologise for asking a difficult question. Look, it's been a tough time for local authorities. It's been a tough time right across the public sector. So I hear quite a lot of the frustration in your voice when you outline the question, and personally, I have a lot of sympathy. So it's difficult. And of course, we could all make decisions. If we were Secretary of State or if we rang the Treasury, of course, we might all come up with different places where we might put the money. But our politicians are elected on a ticket, and that we elect them because ultimately they decide on where to put the pots of money. I think on your particular point about Active Travel England and it having up to 98 staff, hasn't quite got that many yet. It partly reflects there will be a statutory consultee in the planning system, so it's not, that is a transport function, but it's at the interplay between transport and planning. And I don't think we should see it in competition with local authorities. Just because Active Travel England exists, I think it will help many local authorities do what they're trying to do. It will be a centre of expertise, but I don't think we should see that it's going to diminish local authorities instead. I think it's going to add to this agenda in total, and I think that is actually good for everybody. And I think we agree with you that buses are really important. I'm actually seeing much more interest in ministers on buses than I have for a very long time in the department. I do think that buses are have been for a long time a bit of a Cinderella service. My personal prejudice is that reflects who the different users are for different forms of transport, and that the wealthier the people are and the more noise they make, and the more noise they make in the media, the easier it is for politicians to notice when there are problems in those services. So I think who the users are does make a big difference, as it does in lots of other aspects of society. I think that covers your main points. I hope I haven't missed something.
Could I just say I didn't intend to convey that Active Travel England is in any sense in competition with local authorities for funds. What I was saying was, you know, you've got a new agency established almost overnight in government terms, and services, traditional services, which are declining because their need for funding is being either ignored or overruled.
Okay, I think do you want to say anything more about resourcing, Victoria? You covered that quite heavily.
Get on to buses if you want, but there are other questions.
Yeah.
So
we've got two questions in the room. Start here and then come to you, Ben.
Thanks. Hi, Roger Geffen. Part of the week I'm Policy Director at Cycling UK, and the other part of the week I'm coordinating the Low Traffic Future Alliance. With my Cycling UK hat on, firstly to congratulate DFT on getting Active Travel England set up. Really pleased to see it there, and I really hope it thrives, and definitely hope it's not in competition with resources for buses. We're definitely on the same side of that one, as I say, with my Low Traffic Future hat on. Can I go back though to your opening point, Nicola, about the importance of the climate crisis? So I'm going to sort of step back and do a bigger picture question. The government as a whole has now got to come up with a strengthened net zero strategy by the end of March, because the courts sort of held that its previous one was inadequate and inadequately quantified. And at the same time, we've got today an article appearing in Local Transport Today from Greg Marsden, who has been probing away at the government's assumptions behind how its transport decarbonisation plan were actually going to get to net zero. And his verdict, after 2 pages of really thorough analysis, is that we're currently appraising transport projects against background assumptions that are nowhere near net zero compliance. I'm pretty close to his precise wording there. I'm just wondering, therefore, can you say anything, Jessica, about what is the Department of Transport doing to help contribute to the strengthened net zero strategy, and whether you would welcome input, whether the government would help welcome input into strengthening net zero strategy between now and the end of March, alongside everything else that's going on?
I'm going to take Ben's question first, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Hi, Ben Plowden. I'm a board member of the Transport Planning Society. I think this is a question for Victoria and Jessica. So Victoria picked up this situation in London, where the mayor has his special development plan powers, but he also produces a transport strategy which must by law be in conformity with the special plan, and the boroughs must also produce transport plans.
Sorry, that's struggling to hear.
And the boroughs must also produce spatial plans and transport plans that are in conformity with those two plans. I'm just wondering how outside London it might be possible to recreate that kind of degree of legal integration that then drives the policy process, given that the legal framework is very different from the other command authority. Is that possible, and how would you do it?
Brilliant. So a question about how we put together land use plans and transport plans outside of London. How do we make that much closer working given the different regulatory frameworks? And a question about net zero strategy. I don't know which order you want to take those. Do you want to talk about the plans, Victoria, and then we'll come to Jessica?
Yes, thank you for the question. It kind of goes to my earlier point that the way that devolution has been set up in the other regions is, and please, I don't know if there's any press in the room, are there? I should have asked that. Please don't quote me on this. It's sort of, they've been sold a duff deal. You know, they've been sold a, you can have this combined authority, you can have all these powers and this devolution, all the rest of it, but they've not been given the same deal as London, or been offered that deal, with the exception of Andy Street, who has been offered it and actually said he didn't want it, and that's entirely separate political reasons we won't go into this panel. Happy to talk about it offline afterwards. And so it's perfectly possible to do with the statutory instruments that they have been given, their devolution deals. They could have been set up in the same way. It may, I'm not a lawyer, it may have required an Act of Parliament, a la the GLA Act, but you could easily do one devolved areas act, the whole lot up. I mean, we had a localism act in 2011 that enabled them to set up mayoral combined authorities. If there isn't provision in there already to do the same, you know, there's a bill going through now that could have had it in there, but probably won't now. So it might require primary legislation, but it might only require secondary legislation to do it. But the trickle down or the integration you've described is exactly what's needed everywhere else. And I can't fathom out why it hasn't happened, other than those other devolved areas weren't as ahead of the game as perhaps London was in negotiating what went into that first GLA Act or not. And let's not forget, you know, a big champion of making sure all the powers were in the right place, and what we got was what it should have been, was the first mayor of London, who had effectively been sat dormant for 15, 20 years working out what he would do if he got the power again. So London was well advanced. My challenge is to metrometers is learn what London has, and you can be helpful to the government in these devolution deals, because there's a reason why the government's given you these devo deals, not, you know, so you need to be bolder in asking for what London's got, and that's spatial development strategy powers, and it's also fiscal devolution. So I think it's perfectly possible. It just requires some drafting of legislation, or maybe not. Maybe it just needs statutory SIs that could hang off the back of the 2011 Act that enabled them to have those powers in the first place. So I do think there's actually a role for consultancy in helping to get these areas better organised, because again, you know, I don't think we've got anyone who works for a combined authority in the room, have we? Have we? No. And then I'll say what I'm going to say next. You know, my experience of going out and meeting with some of the mayors and some of the teams they've got around them is they haven't got a fraction of the team that the mayor in London had around him, and that's plural him, all three of them, in terms of what they had at disposal with the GLA, with Transport for London, which was, you know, the LDA, all the other strategies, just so much better organised in that experience, and it's just not there in the regions. There are some good people working for the devolved mayors, but they don't have that same level of experience and expertise, and they do need help. So I think there is actually a role for the consultancy sector, which goes down possibly better than saying that they need help from London, because that doesn't go down so well. You can answer the next one. I can't remember what the first question was.
The first question was about net zero, but can I pick up Ben's point first of all? I think, and this is stretching my knowledge, but I think the combined authorities outside London are set up in a very different way. They're much more dependent on their districts. Their districts have quite a different say over the relationship with the combined authority than is the case between the London boroughs and the Mayor of London. at the moment, as Victoria mentioned, there are a number of devolution deals being negotiated. The devolution deals have an extraordinary ability to implement all kinds of things, because normally in a normal run of things, you would need primary legislation to set this kind of thing up. I think I'm not a planner. It's a long time since I've been in the Department for what's now called Department for Levelling Up, but I think you would need primary legislation. That'd be my hunch. And getting primary legislation is as rare as hen's teeth. But the devolution deals allow any power that is in law for any public authority to be copied across. And so you can just raid it magpie-like. So now, if a lawyer were here, they might tell me that's a little bit simplification, but broadly, I think that's my understanding how devolution deals work. I'm not close enough to the Greater Manchester and the West Midlands deal to know in detail every single thing that they are arguing for. I haven't spotted that they have been arguing for this. I think my first question would be, do they want it? And I might be wrong. I just might not be close enough to it to know. Maybe they are. And then the government would want to consider it, I think. On Roger's question about net zero, yes, I am aware the government needs to come up with a plan on net zero by the end of March. I know my colleagues are thinking about it actively. It's still only early February, Roger, and as discussed on local transport plan guidance, best not to say what's going to be in a government strategy until it appears. Would we like some help? I suspect if you'd like to write in with words of wisdom, we would be very, very happy to receive them.
Just one observation, and I'm not an expert on the powers of mayors and so forth, but I remember listening to or reading an article about the powers of mayors in other cities, and that while the Mayor of London has many more powers than mayors of combined authorities, the Mayor of London has very few powers compared to other mayors around the world. So I think this is interesting, maybe take a peek outside our own country to see what powers we might wish for.
Although I also noticed that devolution is good and postcode lottery is bad, and I think they're the same thing.
Brilliant. I think on that note, we ought to wrap up. I was a bit worried whether we would stick to our original time as we had one less speaker, but there was plenty to talk about, and we could probably continue talking for some time over a drink and a nibble in reception. So thank you very much for everyone who's joined in the room. It's lovely to see so many faces here. We are going to stay for a drink if anyone would like to join us. Thank you to everyone who joined online. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. We covered a lot of ground. There's still plenty of questions on Slido, so maybe we'll have a think about how we can share some of those back. And thank you particularly to our three speakers, to Victoria, Jessica and Matthew, for again covering an awful lot of ground, being very open and honest. Yeah, it's great to have you here tonight. So on that note, I'm just going to quickly hand over to Lisa to say
you've said all the thank yous, Nicola. I'm not sure I can add any more. So I will say thank you just to Nicola, and also to Transport Planning Society, which is where this idea first came from. I can see Tim in the room, who chairs our membership subcommittee. One of the feedback pieces we got from the last member survey was members would like to see more events. We've decided as stakeholders to take forward some events. Here's the first one. So please give us some feedback on other topic areas you might be interested in hearing about as part of that event programme, which we are meeting to discuss in a couple of weeks and want to roll out. But yeah, if I can echo that, thanks to all of the speakers. I can't believe it's 6 o'clock. That was really interesting. It flew by. Thank you to the team at Steer, I should say as well, for making sure that the tech worked and everything. Not so much the cameras, Rafa, but there we go. So thank you all for being here. Thank you online too. Bye-bye.